X here to talk about Windblown, as I don't think enough people are talking about this game. Granted, it's an open beta, but it's made by the people who made Dead Cells, Motion Twins, so I picked it up on release maybe about a month ago. I got 20 hours into it, have every weapon unlocked, I think just about everything unlocked, so I wanted to talk a bit about the game and hopefully get some people interested in playing it. Now, I have played a variety of roguelikes, not like a huge binger or anything. I've played like Risk of Rain 2, Hades, and Hades 2. I would say from a game feel perspective, it probably feels the most to Hades 1. Hades 2 actually feels a lot more distinct and different than Hades 1. Hades 2 kind of has a bunch of charge attacks and kind of rewards defensive play and playing around specific areas and letting enemies come into you, whereas Hades 1 and Windblown kind of flourishes with you jumping in the thick of things, getting your big hits off, and just staying in combat for as long as possible. When it comes to being a new player playing Windblown, it does gradually introduce you to the mechanics to make it a bit easier for you, where the unique trinkets that you can unlock as you play, they get introduced a bit later after you've gotten your fair share of using the vanilla weapons, and it introduces a combo mechanic called alter attacks, where after you do a set amount of attacks, you hit your opposite attack button, and then it'll do an empowered attack. So each weapon has its own empowered attack. That way you can actually tailor to your playstyle based on what I like to do. For example, I really like having the beat bolt and the boomerang as kind of a prep to some really strong alter attacks. But you also could just get two fast weapons and just constantly chain between the two different attacks, getting those procs off. Like, for example, when you use the Katars with a different fast attacking weapon, the Katar alter attack gives you bleed on all of your attacks. So then after you proc that, then you might choose to use a different melee weapon like the fish knife, because when you proc that alter attack, it has a bunch of little swipes that proc, and all of those little swipes can add stacks of bleed or flame. So there's a lot of neat combos like that you're kind of forced to find out as you continue to play, because you only get so many strong weapons throughout the run. So whatever higher upgrade weapon, whether it's like level 2 to level 3, you kind of have to jump on that train to make sure that you can stay consistent and do some good damage, unless that low level weapon is something you're using just to proc the other weapon's alter attacks. I'd say one of the ways Windblown really strengthens itself compared to other games in its genre is it really forces you to commit to its combat mechanic with those alter attacks. When you activate them, it makes you immune to damage, and because each weapon has its own alter attack and other weapons have combos, you have to find the interplay between each weapon and find how to use them most effectively for your playstyle and the map. One of the things that I found myself doing is changing up my weapons based on the map I was playing. Like on the first two maps, I usually go for melee weapons because it's really easy to get in there and avoid the attacks. But on the third and fourth map, enemies can hit for like 75% of your health bar. So I usually try to stick to range weapons on those maps, and there's a lot of like fast dashes on the third and fourth maps respectively. And with these weapons changes, one of the other ways your gameplay gets altered would be the gifts. So there's a good pool of like different perks you can get, and each one, well, they're not created equal because there's a lot of things that are just inherently better than others. A lot of them will alter the way you have to approach the fights. There's a bunch of different playstyles you could go into, whether it's focusing on those alter attacks, trying to stack a specific stat to get more damage. You can go a bleed route for damage over time effects. There's also burn effects, some AoE options, and there's also one debuff called Curse, where once you get 10 hits in, they'll take significantly increased damage. And I usually find myself using the kunai, even if it's very underleveled, so long as I can get a strong primary weapon. That way I can reduce their resistances by about 50% and then try to get a really strong alter attack right next to them. I'd say Windblown has a really rewarding game feel when it comes to combat. The longer you play, the stronger you will feel at the game, even though it's mostly player skill that dictates how far you can get to any given run. Being that this is a roguelite, there are means of progression outside of just playing the game, where you can bring cogs back to base and unlock different trinkets or weapons, passive abilities for you to find in your next run. So the game does get easier the longer you play, but thankfully when you defeat the final boss, there is some added difficulty options, so it can increase the damage, the health of enemies, and then give you a harder run the next time. That way you can still feel sufficiently challenged when you're playing, and you still have to play to a decent enough standard to continue to make progress. Now, some of the things I would say I don't particularly love about this game so far, there's some extra gifts that are called hexed gifts, where they're supposed to have a positive and negative effect. I would say a majority of these are considerably worse than they are helpful, to the point where it actually doesn't feel like a reward most of the time to get these, unless you have the reroll perk where you can try to get one of these stronger things in there. And one of the other weaker things I would say is the trinkets overall. They're some extra abilities that are unbound by your weapon. A lot of them don't do considerable damage and they're supposed to be used for utility, but the utility they do provide is quite brief, as most things don't provide a stun for more than a quarter of a second, and the ones that are meant to do damage feel like they do comparable damage to a weapon that's like 1 or 2 levels beneath what you're currently using. The only exception to this, I would say, is the bomb attack, where if you get one that's your current level, you usually do a good third or more of the enemy's health. There's also some weird invulnerability issues with the alter attacks. Once you do enough attacks to do your alter attack, once you do that input for it, you're supposed to be invulnerable during that alter attack. There's a couple weapons that feel like you can get hit when you're not supposed to while you're still attacking, like with the eye blade or the raven blade. There's parts near the end or middle of those attacks where you'll get hit anyways, and all of them do not have any window of iframe once the attack ends. So as soon as you finish your empowered attack where you're invulnerable, you almost always have to dash after it, because if you don't, get hit for free because you didn't hold the dodge button while doing an alter attack. It's kind of annoying. One of the other things this game does have to mitigate annoyances is if you get hit hard enough, it does have one-shot mitigation where it'll leave you with 1 HP. Sometimes, if you're not fighting multiple enemies, it can be helpful, but sometimes it just doesn't matter, because if you get hit by more than one thing, you just die immediately anyways. Another issue this game has is there's a couple enemies that have multi-hit attacks. You theoretically can be hit for almost your full health bar in a quarter of a second because there's hit stun in this game. So if you get hit back to back, you can't dash out of it. Thankfully, attacks generally don't overlap in such a way that you just can't get out at all, but sometimes you'll be left with 1 health and then you have to dash out and use a potion. One of the other great things about weapons is once you get to like level 3, 4, and 5 weapons, in addition to each weapon having its own gimmick, like Telepike has the Marth Tipper, where once something's at its max range, it does more damage and it crits. There's some other variations weapons can get at those higher levels, like higher attack speed but less damage. They could do extra damage if the target is bleeding or burning. They also could have increased distance, or for projectile weapons, if you throw one, it'll start bouncing between targets and ramping up some damage. And these help keep the weapons you are familiar with, give it a little bit of a different flavor and a thing to look out for. So even if you get the same weapon at the same level, you generally want to try to read both to see if one of them fits your playstyle better in that given run with your gifts. One of the other things that weapons really do that makes the game feel holistic and makes it easier for the learning experience, I would say about 50% of the weapons have a 3-hit combo, and once you do those 3 buttons, you can go straight into alter attack. You generally only need to keep track of your button presses for a lot of the weapons in order to chain your combos appropriately. There are a few weapons that don't fall into this design space, but there's more than enough that if you lock down your timing and familiarity with the 3-button combos, then you can segue that into a lot of the weapons and kind of just pick up whatever your run gives you and try to make it work. Overall, I would say Motion Twin did a great job at adapting a roguelite game into a isometric space. And I think most people should try it out if they're into roguelites, especially if you like Hades one.